You bought a lizard for $40. Nobody mentioned the vet bill. Metabolic bone disease, impaction surgery, respiratory infections from the wrong tank. These aren't rare complications. They're the default outcome of the exact starter kits Petsmart sells alongside the animal. Add a lifespan that can outlast your car, an animal that can dehydrate to death next to a full water bowl, and a beginner snake that might not eat for a year, and you start to see the pattern. If you're sick of watching Petsmart hand people a ticking clock and call it a pet, subscribe, because today we're covering the worst reptiles Petsmart sells and exactly what they're not telling you at the register. For decades, Petsmart sold red-eared sliders, tiny green turtles about the size of a bottle cap, sitting in a plastic tub next to the goldfish. But do you know why all of a sudden they stopped selling them entirely? As of Petsmart's own 2025 Corporate Responsibility Report, published this spring, the company has stopped selling turtles and tortoises entirely, citing welfare concerns from in-house vets and outside animal welfare groups. Here's the part that should bother you. Red-eared sliders were never actually sold at that bottle cap size to begin with, not legally. The FDA banned the sale of any turtle under 4 inches back in 1975, specifically because tiny turtles were causing hundreds of thousands of salmonella infections in small children who couldn't help but put them in their mouths. So, the 4-inch juveniles Petsmart used to sell were already the safe version, and they still grow into a 12-inch 4 to 6 pound animal that needs a 100-gallon tank and can live past 40. Petsmart pulling turtles isn't a random act of corporate kindness. It's an admission that an entire category of animal had no business being sold in a strip mall next to the leashes. Keep that in mind, because everything else on this list is still sitting on the shelf right now. Ball pythons get sold with the pitch docile, easy beginner snake. And none of that is technically a lie. They really are calm. They really don't bite often. What the sales pitch leaves out is the 20 to 30 year lifespan, with documented individuals living past 40 and the official longest-lived record snake reaching 47. That snake in the tank is going to outlive your car, your phone, several relationships, and possibly your living situation multiple times over. Then there's the feeding strike. Ball pythons are famous in the reptile community for simply refusing to eat, sometimes for weeks, sometimes for months, occasionally over a year. And it's almost never illness. It's stress, seasonal hormone shifts, or an enclosure that's slightly off on humidity or temperature. New owners panic, assume something is wrong, and either force-feed the snake, which can injure it, or overcorrect the setup into an even worse state, swapping substrates and rearranging the tank in a way that just adds more stress on top of stress. Petsmart's own care sheet quietly admits adults may not eat for several weeks at a time, buried under a much more prominent photo of a smiling kid holding one. On top of the food strikes, ball pythons need humidity held between 60 and 80% at all times, which the standard screen-top glass starter tank actively fights against by venting moisture out the top, meaning the exact setup sold as the complete beginner kit is frequently the reason the humidity keeps crashing in the first place. Nothing about the easy first snake branding prepares you for owning something that might go on a legitimate hunger strike the same month you bring it home. Green anoles are sold for about $8, which is exactly the problem, because $8 signals low commitment, and this animal is anything but. The first thing almost nobody explains at the register: anoles will not drink from a water bowl. They evolved licking dew and rain droplets off leaves, and they genuinely do not recognize standing water as something to drink. So a tank set up with a normal water dish and no misting routine is a tank where the anole is slowly dehydrating while looking perfectly fine to an untrained eye. They also need daily UVB exposure to metabolize calcium, and skipping it leads to metabolic bone disease, a condition where the skeleton itself weakens, which is one of the single most common reasons captive anoles die early. In their native range in the southeastern US, anoles can live around 10 years. Under the cheap starter lizard treatment most buyers give them, plenty don't make it past their first year. Leopard geckos have a reputation as the single easiest reptile you can own, and relative to a chameleon, sure. But easiest reptile has quietly built a culture of neglect around one specific issue: calcium. Because leopard geckos are nocturnal, decades of pet store folklore claim they didn't need UVB lighting at all since they're not out basking in the sun. Current reptile veterinary guidance has walked that back hard, recommending low-level UVB anyway, because geckos still pick up incidental exposure at dawn and dusk in the wild, and the animals kept in the dark, so to speak, show measurably higher rates of metabolic bone disease. On top of that, Petsmart-style starter kits are frequently sold with loose sand or calcium sand substrate marketed as natural, despite it being one of the leading causes of intestinal impaction in the species, because a gecko's sticky tongue picks up substrate along with every cricket it eats. The animal marketed as foolproof is quietly one of the more common patients in exotic vet clinics for exactly the two problems its own starter kit sets it up for. Veiled chameleons are the reptile equivalent of buying a Lamborghini because it looked cool in a magazine. PetSmart's own chameleon section markets them as a great pick for someone who wants something visually spectacular, and visually, they deliver, shifting through greens, yellows, and blues depending on mood, temperature, and social status. Functionally, chameleons are considered one of the least forgiving pets in the entire hobby. Reptile vets report that the average chameleon under beginner care survives well under 2 years, compared to the 5 to 8 years they can reach with an experienced keeper who actually does everything right. Here's the trap. Nobody explains at the register. Chameleons don't recognize still water. You can set up a full water bowl, and your chameleon will dehydrate to death sitting right next to it. Because in the wild, they only ever drink moving droplets off leaves after rain. That means a drip system or an automatic mister isn't optional. It's the difference between a living animal and a dead one within weeks. The enclosure itself is another silent trap. Chameleons need tall, mesh-walled setups with real airflow, not the glass tank most starter kits default to, because poor ventilation in a glass box leads directly to respiratory infections that show up as gasping, wheezing, or bubbling at the mouth. Add in the fact that chameleons are solitary to the point of dying from stress just from seeing another chameleon through the glass of a neighboring tank, and that females can develop life-threatening egg retention even without ever mating, and you've got an animal that looks like a beginner pet and behaves like an ICU patient. Even the coloring people find so charming works against them here, since a stressed, darkening chameleon often just reads as cool color today to someone who doesn't know what they're looking at. Bearded dragons get the same easiest reptile branding, and they run into the exact same substrate trap. Beardies are enthusiastic, indiscriminate eaters, which is part of why they're so popular. They actually seem interested in you at feeding time. That same enthusiasm means a dragon kept on loose sand. Substrate will inevitably swallow some, along with its crickets and greens, and repeated small ingestions build up into impaction, a blockage that, in serious cases, requires surgery. Add inadequate UVB, which is still shockingly common because a lot of starter kits ship with a bulb that doesn't actually put out meaningful UVB output, or doesn't get replaced on schedule even though UVB tubes lose most of their output well before they burn out. And you get metabolic bone disease showing up in a species literally marketed on the promise of being sturdy. A healthy adult bearded dragon needs a 40-gallon plus enclosure and lives 10 to 15 years. A lot of them start life in something roughly a third that size, on the wrong substrate, under a bulb nobody told the buyer expires. There's also a version of this problem PetSmart already tried to quietly fix. The company's animal welfare policy has confirmed the phase-out of fancy bearded dragon morphs, after investigations found breeding for extreme traits like translucent or leatherback skin tied to genuine health defects, which tells you the standard dragon on the shelf isn't even the worst version PetSmart used to carry. Crested geckos look almost cartoonishly friendly, with big eyes and a permanently surprised expression, and they get marketed hard to first-time reptile owners for exactly that reason. Here's the detail that never makes it onto the sales floor. Unlike most other geckos, crested geckos do not regrow their tails. If one drops its tail from rough handling or stress, which is a real and fairly easy to trigger defense mechanism in this species, that's it, permanently, for the rest of its life. It's not medically dangerous to the gecko, but it's a one-way door that a lot of new owners trigger in the first few weeks simply by handling an animal that hasn't settled in yet. grabbing it the wrong way, or letting a kid pick it up like a toy. Combine that with specific humidity requirements that a lot of basic starter tanks don't actually maintain, and you've got an animal sold as low maintenance that's one clumsy grab away from a permanent, visible injury. California king snakes get shelved right next to corn snakes under the same great beginner snake signage, and the resemblance stops at the price tag. King snakes are ophiophagus, meaning they eat other snakes, including other king snakes, including their own siblings from the same clutch. This isn't a rare edge case, it's core to the species biology, and the reason they're called king snakes in the first place, they dominate and consume other snake species in the wild, rattlesnakes included, since they have a natural immunity to pit viper venom. Housing two king snakes together, something a store employee focused on moving inventory might not think to flag, isn't a minor incompatibility. It's a setup where one snake eventually eats the other. And by the time an owner notices, there's only one snake left in the tank and a lot of unanswered questions. Even solo, keepers report king snakes as noticeably more food-motivated and prone to mistaking a hand for prey during feeding compared to the calmer corn snake sitting one tank over with an identical beginner label, which means the bite risk during feeding time is meaningfully higher for an animal marketed as interchangeable with its much mellower neighbor. Corn snakes deserve credit. They really are one of the more forgiving snakes in the trade, hardy, colorful, tolerant of minor husbandry mistakes. The problem isn't the animal, it's what the $8 hatchling price tag doesn't communicate. Corn snakes are escape artists with a documented ability to squeeze through gaps that look sealed to a human eye, and a healthy corn snake lives 15 to 20 years, sometimes longer. People buy them expecting a low-stakes starter pet on the strength of the price, then discover a year in that they're now the parent of an animal that will still be alive when their kid graduates high school that got loose in the walls once already. And that needs a security-conscious enclosure lid nobody mentioned at checkout, because the checkout conversation was about crickets. And finally, a bonus entry, because Petsmart files this animal under its reptile category on the website, right next to snakes and geckos, even though it isn't a reptile at all, the hermit crab. Land hermit crabs cannot currently be bred in captivity at any commercial scale, which means every single hermit crab sold at a pet store, including Petsmart, was pulled from the wild. Undercover investigations at hermit crab supply facilities have documented workers cracking crabs out of their natural shells with metal presses to force them into the painted novelty shells stores sell them in, a process that leaves crabs exposed, injured, and dramatically more likely to die from the stress alone. In the wild, these animals can live 20 to 30 years. In captivity, under typical pet store tank conditions, most die within their first year, and some sources studying the trade put mortality in that range far higher. Hermit crabs also can't survive without periodically molting into a new, larger shell, a behavior that requires burrowing underground for weeks at a time, something almost no starter tank sold alongside them is set up to allow, since most ship with a shallow layer of gravel instead of the deep, diggable substrate. The animal actually needs to complete its own life cycle. It's sold in the reptile aisle, priced like a toy, and it's neither a reptile nor a toy. It's a wild-caught animal with one of the worst captive survival rates of anything sold in a big-box pet store. None of these are bad animals. A veiled chameleon in the hands of someone who built a proper misting system is a genuinely incredible pet. A ball python that eats on schedule and gets handled correctly really can be a 30-year companion. The problem was never the reptile. It's a sales floor built around a 5-minute transaction for an animal that needs a 5 to 40-year commitment, where the checkout conversation covers crickets and heat bulbs and never once covers the word impaction, or won't drink from a bowl, or cannot be housed with another one of itself. PetSmart pulling turtles proves the company already knows this. The rest of the list is still for sale. Know what you're buying before the tank gets to 40 gallons and the fish tank money you budgeted turns out to be a fraction of what you actually needed. If you want to see where the fish side of this problem gets even worse, check out the video on screen. I'll see you in the next one.